The first time Clara Whitmore laid eyes on the torn jacket, she did not see a piece of ruined leather. She saw a man who had stopped caring whether anyone noticed him at all. It was the spring of 1878, in the dust-thick town of Redrock, Texas, a settlement that sat between two cracked ridges like something the earth had tried to swallow and then thought better of. The town had a livery, a general store, a post office no bigger than a closet, a saloon that never truly closed, and a church whose bell had been silent since the previous minister rode away in the dead of a January night, leaving nothing behind but an unpaid bill at the general store and a congregation full of questions. There were perhaps 300 souls in Redrock, if you counted generously, and most of them were the kind of people who had come west because the East had run out of patience for them, or they had run out of patience for the East. Clara was somewhere in the middle of that accounting. She had arrived 8 months earlier, in the late summer of 1877, hired on as a seamstress and housekeeper for Margaret Alcott, the widow who owned the general store. Margaret was 61, iron-backed, and spoke in complete sentences that brooked no interruption. She had placed an advertisement in 3 newspapers across 2 states and received exactly one reply, which was Clara's, and she had hired her on the basis of the handwriting alone, declaring that anyone who formed their letters with that much precision must have been raised with discipline. Clara had not corrected this assumption. She had been raised by a grandmother who believed that survival required neatness, and neatness required effort, and effort required silence, and so Clara had grown into a woman who expressed herself through her hands rather than her mouth, through the precise tension of a stitch, the careful press of a hem, the deliberate choice of thread that would hold through hard use and hard weather. She was 24 years old and had the kind of quiet that people sometimes mistook for coldness, and the kind of steadiness that people sometimes mistook for contentment. She was neither cold nor fully content, but she had made her peace with the life she had built in Redrock, because it was hers, and because it was honest, and because Margaret paid her fairly and let her keep her evenings for her own work. She had set up a small sewing table near the front window of the store, because the light was best there in the mornings, and she mended shirts and trousers, and occasionally a dress for the few women in town who could afford the luxury of having something repaired rather than simply wearing it until it fell apart entirely. She charged modest prices and did exceptional work, and had quietly built a small reputation in the 8 months she had been there, which was to say that people brought her their worst items and trusted her completely, which was more than most people in Redrock had managed to earn. The morning the cowboy rode in, it was a Tuesday in April, and the wind was doing what the wind in Texas always did in April, which was everything at once. It threw grit against the storefront windows and rattled the hanging sign above the saloon, and pushed the dust into long, low rolls across the main street like something alive and irritable. Clara had been at her sewing table since before the store opened, working on a patch job for old Tom Ferris, who had caught his coat sleeve on a nail and refused to buy a new one on principle. She was nearly finished when the sound of hooves broke through the wind, and she glanced up through the glass out of habit. He came in from the North Road, which was the direction most people came from if they had been out working the open range rather than coming from a town. He was riding a bay horse, dark and well-built, the kind of horse that had been chosen for endurance rather than speed, and the man on its back matched that quality in the way he sat, not relaxed exactly, but settled, as though the saddle was simply part of where he belonged. He wore a hat that had been good once and was now something more honest than good, shaped by weather and time into a thing that fit him perfectly. His duster was the color of the road. And his jacket, the one visible at the open collar of the duster, was torn. Clara noticed it the way she noticed all fabric, which was immediately and without meaning too. The right shoulder of the brown leather jacket had a tear running from the upper seam downward for perhaps 4 inches, the kind of tear that happened when leather caught hard on something unforgiving, and then gave way all at once. It was the kind of damage that was easy to repair if you knew how, and nearly impossible to repair neatly if you did not, and she could see from where she sat that no one had attempted to repair it at all. It had simply been left. She watched him ride past the window and disappear toward the livery, and then she looked back down at Tom Ferris's coat sleeve and finished the patch with the same steady attention she gave everything. But some part of her mind stayed on that jacket the way a tongue stays on a sore tooth, not with pain exactly, but with a persistent and particular awareness. His name was Jesse Calloway, and she learned it before noon, because Redrock was small enough that a stranger's name traveled faster than the stranger himself. Margaret heard it from the post office clerk, who heard it from the livery boy, who heard it from Jesse himself, when he asked how long a man could stable a horse for reasonable money. The livery boy had reported that the man was polite but not much for talking, that he paid in actual coin rather than credit, and that he had the look of someone who had been riding for a long time without any particular destination in mind, and had simply stopped here because the horse needed rest, and the rider had run out of reason to keep moving. Clara tucked this information away without comment. She had learned in her life that the most interesting things were the ones people did not announce. Jesse Calloway took a room at the boarding house run by a stout and efficient woman named Dora Webb, who charged fair rates and served 3 meals a day, and did not tolerate drinking in the rooms. He appeared at the general store the following morning to purchase coffee, dried beans, a box of cartridges, and a candle, which Margaret observed meant he either planned to leave soon or planned to stay, but was not yet sure, because a man planning to stay long bought more candles. He paid, nodded to Margaret, and glanced briefly across the store toward the window where Clara sat with her needle and thread, but he did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him. But she saw the jacket again in that clear morning light, and she confirmed what she had suspected from a distance. The tear was clean, which meant the leather was still good, and the stitching along the original seam had held everywhere except where the tear had started, which meant the jacket itself was well made and worth preserving. It would take perhaps 40 minutes of careful work with a leather needle and wax thread, and it would hold better than new. She went back to her own work and told herself it was none of her business. He appeared at the store twice more that week, once for tobacco and once for a new tin cup because his old one had developed a crack, and each time he paid his money and left without lingering, and each time Clara glanced at the jacket from the corner of her eye the way she could not help glancing at any piece of damaged work, with the particular restlessness of someone who could see the solution clearly and had not been asked to apply it. On the 5th day after his arrival, which was a Saturday, the town took on its weekend bustle, which in Redrock meant that the general store was full from mid-morning onward, and the saloon would be genuinely loud by afternoon. Clara gave up her sewing table to the traffic of customers and went to work in the back room, where Margaret kept the stock, and where there was a sturdier table better suited to the cutting work she was doing for a new dress order from the minister's former wife, who was one of the few women in town with both the resources and the inclination to commission proper dress work. Jesse Calloway came in at mid-morning with the rest of the crowd, and this time he did not immediately leave. He stood at the counter waiting his turn. He had come for flour and a small slab of salt pork, which suggested, Margaret would later note with satisfaction, that he had moved past the stage of uncertain staying and into the stage of actual cooking, which meant he had at least some intention of remaining for a while. While he waited, he leaned against the counter with the loose patience of a man who had spent a great deal of his life waiting for things, horses to calm, weather to break, lines to move, trouble to pass. And he looked around the store the way a person looks at a place they are beginning to read rather than merely see. His eyes passed over the sewing table near the window, which was empty now but still set up with Clara's basket and tools exactly as she left them. The way a kitchen is still a kitchen, even when the cook is not in it, and something in his expression shifted briefly before going still again. Clara came through the back room door with a bolt of fabric over one arm, intending to find a specific shade of ribbon in the front display, and she nearly walked directly into him, because he had stepped back from the counter to allow room for Mrs. Osgood and her enormous basket, and the space he had stepped into was exactly where Clara had planned to walk. She stopped short. He stopped short. They were close enough that she could see the wear in the leather of his jacket in actual detail now, and the tear was even cleaner than she had thought, a single decisive split along the grain of the hide, perhaps 4.5 inches, running from just below the shoulder seam. "Pardon me," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and had an East Texas flatness to it, the kind of accent that had been worn smooth by years of not staying in one place. "My fault entirely," she said. "I was not watching where I was going." He looked at her the way people sometimes looked at Clara when they first spoke to her, as though they had expected less and were recalibrating. And then he looked at the bolt of fabric in her arms, and then, because he was apparently a man of straightforward observation rather than careful social pretense, he looked at his own jacket, which she had been looking at, and said, "You do the sewing work here." "I do," she said. He nodded once, the kind of nod that was not agreement but acknowledgement, and stepped aside to let her pass, and that was the entirety of their first real exchange. But she caught something in his eyes before she looked away, not embarrassment about the jacket, and not the dismissiveness of a man who did not care about his appearance, but something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. Something that looked like a man who had simply stopped expecting anyone to offer him anything he had not first asked for, and who had therefore stopped asking. She found her ribbon and went back to the cutting work, and she thought about what she had seen in his face for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, when the store had closed and the street had gone to its quieter Saturday night tempo, the saloon loud in the distance, the rest of Redrock settling, Clara sat at her private work table in the small room off the back of the store that Margaret had given her for her own sewing, and she threaded a leather needle with heavy wax thread in a dark brown that was close enough to the color of his jacket to be invisible in the repair, and she thought about the logic of what she was doing. Because she liked to be honest with herself about her own motivations. It was not pity. She had examined this possibility carefully and set it aside because it did not fit. The man did not appear to need pity, and pity was not what she felt. It was closer to what she felt when she passed a fence post that had gone crooked, a specific and practical dissatisfaction, with a fixable problem that was being left unfixed. She liked things to be whole and well-made and properly maintained, and a good jacket with an easily repaired tear left unrepaired was an offense to her sense of how things ought to be. That was all it was. She told herself this firmly, and then she thought about the way he had looked at his own jacket when she glanced at it, and the complicated quiet in his eyes, and she acknowledged to herself with her characteristic honesty that perhaps it was not entirely all it was. But she threaded the needle anyway, because the work itself needed doing regardless of the reason, and because she had in her possession, she had discovered this 2 days earlier, a scrap of leather from the same tannery and approximate vintage as his jacket, which Margaret kept in a drawer of miscellaneous materials she had accumulated over the years, and it was close enough in color and texture that a backing piece would be nearly invisible from the outside once the stitching was done. It was, objectively, an excellent repair opportunity, and she was a person who did not let those go to waste. The difficulty, of course, was that she did not have the jacket. She solved this problem the way she solved most problems, which was by thinking about it carefully until the solution appeared. She had noticed, on each of his visits to the store, that Jesse Calloway wore the jacket over a shirt but under the duster on cooler mornings, and that on the warmer part of Saturday afternoon he had come in without the duster entirely, meaning he sometimes wore the jacket alone. She had also noticed that on Monday mornings, Dora Webb collected the laundry from her boarders and brought it to the store in a basket to be picked up by the woman on the south edge of town who did the washing for pay. And that this arrangement passed directly through the general store, because Margaret ran a kind of informal hub for this and a dozen other small services. She could wait until Monday. She spent Sunday in a state of distracted patience, which expressed itself as unusually precise work on the dress she was making and an unusually thorough sweeping of the back room. And on Monday morning, she was at the front of the store when Dora Webb came through with her laundry basket, and when she spotted the familiar brown leather jacket folded on top of the pile, because Dora, like Clara, was a practical woman who believed things should be properly maintained and had apparently also noticed the tear. Though not known what to do about it, Clara said simply, "I can mend that jacket before it goes to Eli's wife for washing. It will take me an hour and I will have it back before the washing is done." Dora looked at her, looked at the jacket and said, "The man didn't ask for mending." "No," Clara agreed, "but it needs doing." Dora considered this for a moment with the pragmatic assessment of a woman who had been running a boarding house for 15 years and had developed an accurate sense of which things were worth discussing and which were simply true. Then she put the jacket on the counter and took the rest of the laundry to Eli's wife, and Clara took the jacket to her table. The work was exactly as she had estimated, 40 minutes from start to finish, because the backing piece fit well and the leather was still supple, and her hands were steady and certain in the way they were always certain when she was doing something she understood completely. She reinforced the original seam line for 2 inches on either side of the tier, ran the main repair along the grain of the hide, and finished with a close-set stitch pattern that would hold through serious use. The result was, from any reasonable viewing distance, invisible. Up close, if you knew where to look, you could see the deliberateness of the work, the precision of the stitching, the care of the reinforcement, but it did not announce itself, and that was exactly as it should be. She ran her thumb along the repair one last time, the way she always tested her own work, and then she folded the jacket exactly as Dora had folded it and placed it back on the counter before Dora returned. She did not expect him to notice. Or rather, she expected that he would notice eventually, as one notices any change to a familiar garment, but she did not expect it to matter to him the way it mattered to her. She had done the work because it needed doing, and that was the end of it. She was wrong about that. Jesse Calloway had been in Redrock for 2 weeks now, and he had begun, in his quiet way, to find the shape of the place. He had learned the schedule of the livery, the hours of the general store, the name of every man he had played cards with in the saloon. He played cards on Friday evenings, for modest stakes, because it was a way of sitting among people without having to produce conversation, and the particular geography of the main street at every hour of the day. He had not learned what he was going to do next, which had been true of him for the better part of 3 years, and which he had stopped finding troubling and started simply accepting as the condition of his life. He was 30 years old and had spent the last 11 of those years doing the kind of work the West required and rewarded: cattle drives, ranch labor, the occasional job that required a man who could handle himself and did not ask too many questions about the details. He had ridden the Kishom Trail twice as a hired hand and once as a trail boss. He had worked 3 different ranches across Texas and Kansas. He had been good at all of it and had found, somewhere around his 27th year, that being good at something was not the same as wanting to keep doing it, and that this distinction mattered more than he had previously allowed himself to believe. He had left the last ranch in the fall of 1877 with his pay and his horse and his intentions, and had spent the subsequent months in a kind of moving ambiguity, going from one place to the next without urgency, trying to figure out what he was looking for without yet knowing what to call it. Redrock had stopped him not because it was remarkable, but because it was not. It was simply a town that existed, doing the business of existing, and there was something restful about that after too long on the open road. He had intended to stay a week and had extended to 2 without quite deciding to, and when the second week ended he was still there, which he took as information about something without yet knowing what. He picked up his laundry from Dora on Monday afternoon, folded in the basket the way Dora always returned things, with a thoroughness that he suspected was her way of demonstrating that she ran a proper establishment rather than merely a functional one. And he took it back to his room and put things away item by item the way he did everything, methodically and without hurry. When he came to the jacket, he shook it out to fold it properly, and he stopped. He turned it toward the window light and looked at the right shoulder for a long moment. Then he ran 2 fingers along the repair, the way Clara had run her thumb, testing it. The leather was solid and smooth, and the stitch line was barely perceptible even under his fingertips. He turned the jacket over and looked at it from the inside, where the backing piece was visible, and he looked at the small, even stitches for a long time with an expression that was difficult to name, because it was several things at once, surprise and something that was not quite surprise, something older and more worn than surprise, like a man who has been in the cold long enough that warmth, when it comes, is briefly disorienting. He had owned this jacket for 6 years. He had bought it in Abilene in 1872 from a leather worker who made good things for honest prices, and it had been with him across 3 states and more miles than he had kept count of. He had torn the shoulder 18 months ago on a fence post in the dark, catching it in a hurry to get through a gate that turned out to be latched wrong, and he had looked at the tear the next morning in the light and thought that he ought to get it fixed, and then had not, because in the weeks that followed there was always something more immediate requiring his attention, and eventually the torn jacket became simply the jacket, and he had stopped seeing the tear at all, which was how he had come to stop bothering. Someone had seen it. Someone had taken the time to not only repair it properly, but to repair it with a backing piece, which meant whoever had done it had understood that the repair needed to hold, not just close. Someone had done this without being asked, and without making any announcement of having done it, and had returned the jacket as though nothing had happened. He knew who had done it. There was only one person in Redrock who worked with leather and thread, and who had access to the laundry on Monday mornings, and he had seen the way she looked at his jacket every time he came into the store. Not the way people looked when they were being politely appalled by someone's appearance, but the way she looked at everything, which was with the steady attention of someone who was figuring out how something worked and how to make it better. He put the jacket on and stood for a moment in the middle of his small room at Dora's boarding house, and he felt something shift in him that he had not expected to feel, something that was not easily named but that was, at its most honest, the recognition of a specific quality in another person. The quality of someone who did things because they needed doing, without calculation, without expectation of acknowledgement, with only the quiet integrity of caring whether the world around them was whole and well-made. He had been looking for something for 3 years without knowing what to call it. He thought perhaps he was beginning to know. He went to the general store the next morning, which was Tuesday, and he was not entirely certain what he was going to say, only that he was going to say something. Clara was at her window table when he came in, working on something blue and complicated that involved a great deal of careful pinning, and she looked up when the door opened with the same steady, direct attention she gave everything, and she saw that he was wearing the jacket, and she looked back down at her work with the small, controlled neutrality of a woman who had been hoping something would happen and had not admitted it to herself. He crossed the store and stopped at a respectful distance from her table and said, "I found my jacket repaired." "I noticed it needed doing," she said, not looking up from her pinning. "I don't recall asking," he said, and there was something in his tone that was not reproach but its opposite, a kind of careful, almost questioning gentleness, like a man stepping onto unfamiliar ground and finding it more solid than he expected. "You did not ask," she agreed. "But the jacket is good leather, and the tear was clean, and it would have been a waste to leave it." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him standing there with that particular stillness of his, the one that was not passivity but attention, and she kept her eyes on her pins because looking up felt like more than she was ready for at this particular second. "I've had that jacket 6 years," he said. "It shows," she said. "It's been well made and well used. The repair will hold." Another pause, then, "What do I owe you?" She looked up then because the question deserved a direct response, and she was not a woman who gave indirect ones. "Nothing," she said. "It was a short piece of work, and I had the materials already." He looked at her for a moment with those steady, dark eyes. She saw now that they were a deep amber brown, the color of good whiskey held up to light, which was a comparison she immediately felt was somewhat embarrassing and set aside, and then he said, "Clara Whitmore, is that your name?" "It is," she said. "I'm Jessie Calloway." "I know," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was headed in that direction, and he nodded once, the same acknowledgement nod she had seen before, though with something different underneath it this time, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Whitmore, for the jacket." "You are welcome, Mr. Calloway," she said. He bought a box of matches and a small bag of cornmeal and left, and Clara looked back down at her pinning and realized that her hands were not quite as steady as usual, which she observed with curiosity and irritation in equal measure. The following Friday he sat down across from her at the table in the general store. She had not expected this. She was eating her lunch. Margaret always went to Dora's for the midday meal on Fridays, and Clara ate at the work table, which she preferred because she could read while she ate. And she looked up from her book to find Jessie Calloway standing on the other side of the table with his hat in his hand, and an expression that managed to be both uncertain and decided at the same time, which was a combination she found unexpectedly interesting. "Would you mind if I sat?" he asked. "There is a chair," she said, which she immediately recognized was not precisely a warm welcome and a Mended. "Please do." He sat. He placed his hat on the corner of the table, brim up, the way a man set a hat when he planned to stay for a while. She marked her page in the book. It was a collection of essays she had ordered from a bookseller in San Antonio, and waited. "What are you reading?" he asked. She told him, and he nodded with the genuine interest of a man who read when he could, which she learned over the next half hour as they talked. He had brought his own lunch, a biscuit and some dried venison from Dora's kitchen, and he ate it in the unhurried way he did everything, and they talked about books and then about Texas and then, with the natural drift of conversation that is finding its own level, about the things people miss when they have been moving for a long time. "Trees," he said. "I miss actual trees, not scrub, trees that have had enough water to grow tall." "I grew up in Virginia," she said. "I know what you mean." There was a road near my grandmother's house that was lined with oaks on both sides, and in the summer they came together at the top like a tunnel. I have not seen anything like it since I came west. He looked at her with that particular attention of his, not the glancing observation of social conversation, but the actual looking of someone who is listening with more than his ears, and he said, "What brought you to Texas?" She told him honestly, about her grandmother's death, about the practical necessity of finding work, about the advertisement and Margaret's handwriting theory, and the strange comfort of having arrived somewhere, and found it livable when it might easily not have been. "What keeps you here?" he asked. She considered. "I like the work," she said. "I like Margaret even when she is formidable. I like that I built something here that is mine." She paused. "What keeps you anywhere, Mr. Calloway? You strike me as a man who has not stayed in one place very long." "You are not wrong," he said. He looked at his hat on the corner of the table for a moment. "I have been trying to figure out what would make a place worth staying." She did not ask him whether he had figured it out, because the question felt too large for a first Friday lunch, and she had enough self-possession to know that some conversations needed to grow at their own pace. But she thought about it after he left. Over the following 3 weeks he came and sat with her on Tuesday and Friday lunches, which became the arrangement by natural agreement rather than explicit declaration, and each time they talked longer and covered more ground. His years on the trail, the specific geography of places he had been, the way the Kansas sky looked in late October when the storms were coming down from the north. She told him about her grandmother, who had been a practical and unsentimental woman who nevertheless kept a garden of extraordinary beauty, because she believed that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity, and the garden was where she expressed everything she could not easily say in words. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and he said that his mother had been similar, a woman who did not often speak her deeper feelings but who communicated them through action, through the things she made and maintained, and he thought there was a kind of honesty in that way of living that was undervalued by people who expected feelings to come with loud announcement. Clara looked at him when he said this and felt something shift in the conversation, or perhaps in herself, that was unmistakable and quiet, and had the quality of something settling into place. She did not examine it too closely. She had lived her life by not rushing things that should not be rushed, by trusting the integrity of good work done patiently, and she applied this same principle now with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the best repairs were the ones that held. Jesse, for his part, was doing his own quiet figuring. He had taken on work at the stable at the edge of town, helping the owner, a broad-handed man named Clyde Rourke, with the breaking of a difficult young gelding that had defeated every approach so far, and this suited him because it gave him honest work and a reason to stay that was not merely the absence of a reason to leave. He was good with horses in the particular way of a man who understood that animals, like people, responded to patience and consistency rather than force, and the gelding was coming along well after 2 weeks of careful, methodical work. Clyde Rourke was a talker and a good-natured one, and he told Jesse everything there was to know about Redrock within the first week, including the story of the previous minister, who had turned out to be something less than advertised, and the ongoing dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers over water rights, and the history of every family in town. He mentioned Clara with the frank admiration of a man who liked direct people and had recognized a quality he respected. That woman over at Alcott's does the best repair work in 4 counties, and she never overcharges, and she does not gossip, which makes her practically a saint by Redrock standards. Jesse agreed without saying so out loud, which was his way. One evening in late April, toward the end of a day that had gone soft and golden in the way spring evenings in Texas sometimes did, the wind finally quiet, the dust settled, the light lying warm across the flat rooftops. Jesse was on his way back from the stable to the boarding house, and he passed the general store window and saw Clara still at her table in the last of the light, not sewing but sitting with her head in her hand and her book open. And there was something in her posture that was different from her usual composed steadiness. Something tired, not the tired of a long day, but the tired that came from a longer accumulation than a single day. He stopped outside the door for a moment, his hand on the frame, and asked himself what he was doing and answered himself honestly, which was that he wanted to go in and ask her if she was all right, which was a simple thing but had, for him, the weight of something larger, because it required him to act on what he felt rather than simply continue to feel it quietly from a careful distance. He went in. She looked up and the tiredness was still there, and she did not immediately replace it with her usual composed expression which told him something. "Long day," he said. "Long correspondence," she said. "I had a letter from Virginia." She paused, and then, because he was looking at her with that attention that somehow made withholding feel more effortful than honesty, she said, "My grandmother's house has been sold, by my cousin who had the legal standing to do it. I knew it was coming eventually, but knowing a thing is coming is not quite the same as it arriving." He came and sat in the chair across from her that he now thought of as his chair because it had become his chair, and he said, "I am sorry." "It is only a house," she said. "No," he said quietly. "It is not only a house. It is the oak trees and the garden and the evidence that something you loved once actually existed and mattered. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face before, an expression of being genuinely seen, fully and without performance, and her eyes went briefly bright with something before she blinked it back to steadiness. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is." They sat for a while in the quiet of the store, in the last warm light, and he did not try to fix what could not be fixed, and she did not pretend it was already fixed, and it was the most honest half-hour either of them had spent with another person in a very long time. As the light finally gave out and Clara began to tidy her table, he said, "There is something I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because I am not a man who does well with anything that isn't plain." She stilled her hands and looked at him. "I came to this town without any particular intention," he said. "I have been in that condition for 3 years, moving without direction, waiting for something to become clear to me without knowing what I was waiting for. I have spent the past month sitting across from you at lunch twice a week and talking about everything and nothing, and I find that I look forward to those lunches the way I have not looked forward to anything in longer than I can clearly remember. I think you are one of the finest people I have ever encountered, and I am saying this plainly because I think you deserve plain, honest things rather than elaborate ones." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the store window, the street had gone to its evening quiet, and the last light was the deep blue just before full dark, and the lamp on her table had not been lit yet, so they were sitting in that particular threshold between day and night where things felt slightly out of time. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are also one of the finest people I have encountered. And I think you should know that I did not mend your jacket because it was my job or because I was being charitable, and I have been trying to be honest with myself about why I did it. And the truest answer I have arrived at is that I wanted to do something for you specifically, which was unfamiliar to me because I am a person who does not generally act without good reason. And the reason in this case was simply that you mattered to me, even though we had barely spoken. In the way that certain things matter before you have had time to understand why. The silence after this was not empty but full. The way the silence after something important is said is always full. "Clara," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality that was different from how anyone had said it before, not formal, not casual, but true, the way you say something when you mean it completely. "Yes," she said. "Would you allow me to take you to supper?" he said. "Not at the boarding house. There is a woman on the east side of town who does a good meal on Saturday evenings, Mrs. Birch, and I have been past her window and it smells properly like something worth eating. I would like to take you to supper at a proper table and talk to you across it without the laundry or the customers or the general store between us." She allowed herself, for the first time since she had been a young girl, the small pleasure of a full smile, which transformed her face in a way that made Jessie Calloway feel, somewhat unreasonably, like every mile of the last 3 years had been worth covering. "I would like that very much," she said. Mrs. Birch's Saturday suppers were a Redrock institution that Clara had never attended, partly because she did not often take her evenings out and partly because it required a companion, and she had not had one of those available until now. The evening was warm and the walk from the general store to Mrs. Birch's house at the east end of Main Street was short enough to be comfortable and long enough for two people to find the rhythm of walking side by side, which was its own kind of conversation. Mrs. Birch was a small, bright-eyed woman of 50 who had lost her husband to a fever 3 years earlier and had responded to this catastrophe by becoming an extraordinary cook on a professional level, hosting supper every Saturday evening for 8 to 10 guests at 2 long tables in her front room, charging a reasonable flat price and serving whatever she had made that day, which was always better than whatever you had hoped for. That evening it was beef roasted with dried chilies and herbs, cornbread done properly in a cast iron pan, early spring greens dressed with vinegar, and a pie of canned peaches and brown sugar for dessert that was, Clara thought, the best thing she had eaten in a very long time. They sat across from each other, as Jessie had described, at the long table among 7 other guests, 2 ranchers' wives, a surveyor passing through, old Tom Ferris who came every Saturday and owned it as a personal tradition, and 3 young men from the cattle operation to the north who spoke loudly and ate enthusiastically, and then settled into relative quiet under the combined social gravity of the women at the table. The conversation ranged widely and impersonally for most of the meal, the way dinner table conversation did when the company was mixed and mostly strangers. But Jessie and Clara had their own conversation running underneath it, built of glances and small expressions, and the particular attentiveness of 2 people who have found their frequency and are staying on it even amid noise. He walked her back to the general store afterward. The night was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky that the open west produced with a careless extravagance that Clara had never quite stopped finding overwhelming after a lifetime of eastern skies obscured by trees and buildings. They stood for a moment outside the store door, neither of them in a hurry to be done with the evening. "Thank you," she said, "for the supper. It was very good." "Mrs. Birch is a genuine artist," he agreed. "I have a theory that hardship either makes a person smaller or turns them into something remarkable, and she appears to have gone entirely the second direction." "I think that is true of several people I know," Clara said. He looked at her, and she understood that she was included in what he meant, and she did not deflect it the way she sometimes deflected the things that were true about her, because this evening felt like a place where deflection was not appropriate. "I would like to do this again," he said, "and again after that, and as many times as you will allow me." "Jessie," she said, and it felt natural to use his name like something that had always been there and simply not yet deployed. "I think you should know that I am not a person who does things halfway. When I commit to something, I commit to it fully, whether it is a hem or a friendship or anything else. So if you are asking what I think you are asking, you should know that about me." "Clara," he said, and there was that quality again, the one that made her name sound like it was being said for the first time, and also like it had always been said this way. "That is entirely the most encouraging thing anyone has ever told me." She laughed, a full, genuine laugh, the kind she did not produce very often but which, when it appeared, had the quality of something that had been held in reserve for the right moment. And he looked at her laughing with an expression that was entirely unguarded, all the careful steadiness of his face simply gone, replaced by something open and warm and young in a way that had nothing to do with age. He did not kiss her. He was not a man who rushed things, and she was not a woman who would have welcomed being rushed, and the evening ended with his hand briefly finding hers and squeezing it once lightly, which was exactly right. May arrived in Redrock with heat and blossoms and the practical business of late spring, which meant cattle were moving, and the town was busier than usual, and Margaret's store was doing well enough that she hired a boy to help with deliveries. Jessie had finished the work with the difficult gelding. The horse had come around completely under his patient handling, and Clyde had paid him fairly and offered him more work when it was available, and he had begun to help at a small ranch 5 miles from town owned by a man named Garrett Wells, who ran a modest operation of 300 head and was honest about his finances and needed a reliable hand through the busy season. Jessie had stopped thinking about where he was going next. This was new. For 3 years the question had been constant, a background noise he had almost stopped noticing, and now it was simply absent, displaced by the much more immediate and interesting business of being somewhere and wanting to stay there. He and Clara had settled into a pattern that suited them both, the Tuesday and Friday lunches, the Saturday supper at Mrs. Birch's which had become their standing arrangement, and occasionally an evening walk when the temperature had cooled and the day's work was done, out past the edge of town to where the land opened up, and the sky came down on all sides, and you could stand in the middle of it and feel appropriately small. On these walks they talked, and sometimes they did not talk, and both were equally comfortable, which Jesse had found over his 30 years to be a very rare quality in any companionship. In the second week of May, something happened that changed the texture of the town around them in a way that could not be ignored. One of the two ranchers who had been in ongoing dispute over water rights, a man named Hollis Crane, who ran a large spread to the north and had the financial backing that came with operating on that scale, came into town and made it publicly known at the saloon that he intended to dam the creek that ran through the border of the smaller ranch owned by a man named Pete Dawson, which would effectively ruin Dawson's water access. This was not, strictly speaking, within Crane's legal rights under the water agreements that had been drawn up when both ranches were established, but Crane had recently gotten the ear of a county official in the next town over, and the practical application of legal rights in 1878 in Texas had a great deal to do with who you knew and how much weight you could apply, and Crane had more of both than Dawson. Pete Dawson was 53, slow-moving, and honest in the way of a man who had never found it profitable to be otherwise, and he had 2 daughters and a son who worked the ranch with him and a wife who had recently been ill, and he did not have the money for lawyers or the connections to fight Crane on Crane's own terms. He came into the general store on a Wednesday morning and spoke with Margaret, who was on the town council in all but formal name. Redrock did not have a formal council, but it had Margaret Alcott, who served the same function, and the store filled up with the particular tense atmosphere of a community problem looking for a solution. Jesse heard about it from Clyde Rourke that evening and said nothing, but the following morning he went to see Pete Dawson. Clara learned about this from Margaret, who had learned it from Clyde, which was how most information traveled in Redrock, and she thought about what it told her about Jesse Calloway, that when he heard of an injustice being applied against a man without the power to fight it, his response was not to opine about it at the saloon or to wait and see how it developed, but to go and speak to the man directly and find out what could actually be done. What could actually be done, it turned out, was a formal filing with the county land office citing the original water agreement, which existed in writing. Jesse had asked Dawson about the paperwork, and Dawson, who had always kept meticulous records even when no one expected him to, produced it, combined with a ride to the county seat to file the complaint before Crane could get his unofficial arrangement formalized through his connection. Jesse offered to make the ride, because he knew the county seat from a previous pass-through, and because Dawson's son had a broken hand and couldn't do it quickly on horseback, and the timing mattered. He was gone for 3 days, which were 3 days that Clara occupied with work and the deliberate avoidance of asking Margaret too many questions about when he was expected back. She was not worried precisely. He was a capable man on a straightforward errand, but she was aware of his absence the way you became aware of a sound you had not noticed until it stopped. He came back on a Friday evening with a receipt from the county land office and the information that the complaint had been officially filed, and that Crane's informal arrangement had no legal standing against a prior written agreement, and that Pete Dawson's water rights were, for the moment, secure. Whether Crane would accept this or find another angle was a longer question, but for now the immediate crisis was resolved. Dawson shook Jesse's hand at the stable in front of half a dozen witnesses, including Clyde, including Tom Ferris, including 2 of the women from the church committee, and said, "I don't know why you did that for a man you barely know." And Jesse said, "Because it was the right thing and someone was in a position to do it," which Clara heard about from 3 separate sources before he came to find her at the store. He came in at the end of his first day back, on a Saturday morning, and he looked tired from the riding but settled in the particular way he looked when he had done something that aligned with what he thought was right. And she set down her work, and he sat in his chair, and she poured him coffee from the pot Margaret kept on the stove in the back, and she handed it to him without ceremony, and he received it without ceremony. and they sat together in the morning light of the store with the sound of the street coming in through the open door, and she said, "You did a good thing." "It needed doing," he said, which made her look at him with an expression she was not sure she had full control over, because those were the same words she had used about his jacket, and the echo of them was not accidental. He was looking at her with those amber-brown eyes, and the corners of them had the softness that appeared when he was not being careful about what he showed, and she understood that the echo had been intentional and precise, and she felt something in her chest that was large and warm and entirely beyond her usual capacity to keep at a managed distance. She reached across the work table and put her hand over his, the way he had done to her that first evening, lightly, briefly, without declaration but also without possibility of being misread, and she said, "Yes, it did." They were quiet together in the morning light, and outside the store the town moved and breathed around them, and neither of them said what they both already knew, because it did not require saying yet. But it was there between them like the repaired seam on a good jacket, solid and holding, and made to last. The declaration, when it came in June, and it came from both of them at once in the way the best declarations do, which is to say, it came from an ordinary moment that turned, without warning or contrivance, into an extraordinary one. They had taken their usual evening walk on a Wednesday, which was not a usual walk day, but the evening had been too perfect to stay indoors. The heat had broken early, and the air was clean from a brief afternoon rain, and the sky to the west was a color that Clara could not name, but that she felt in her chest the way she felt music, if she ever got to hear any. They had walked out past the edge of town toward the low ridge to the north, which was a longer walk than they usually took, and they had sat on a wide flat rock that jutted from the hillside and looked at the valley and the town in the fading light. He had been talking about the ranch work, about a particular morning when he had been moving cattle across the low creek, and the light had come through the brush at a specific angle that reminded him of something from when he was a boy, a morning in the piney woods of East Texas where he had grown up, and Clara had been listening with her chin in her hand and her whole attention on him and on the view, and there was a moment when he stopped talking and looked at her looking at the land. And the light was doing something specific to the angle of her face, and he felt what he had been feeling for 2 months arrive in its final and undeniable form. "Clara," he said. She turned and looked at him. "I love you," he said, plain as he had promised to be. "I want you to know that. I want to stop carrying it around unspoken because I do not think you deserve unspoken things, and I am not entirely sure I am capable of continuing to be in your company without saying it." She was quiet for a moment. The valley below them was turning gold and long-shadowed in the evening light, and somewhere in the town a dog was making its evening commentary on the neighborhood, and the air smelled of wet earth and scrub sage from the afternoon rain. "Jessie," she said. "Yes," he said. "I love you too," she said. "I have been aware of it for longer than I am entirely comfortable admitting, but I am not going to be dishonest about it simply because it is somewhat inconvenient to have discovered." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that was entirely unguarded, the one that made him look young and open, and without any of the careful reserve of a man who has been moving alone for too long. And then he reached over and tucked a loose strand of her hair behind her ear with a gentleness that was so deliberate and so precisely tender that she felt it in the bones of her face. And then he kissed her for the first time in the golden evening light on the hillside above Redrock, Texas. And it was, she would think later and often, exactly right. Exactly, unhurriedly, entirely right. They walked back to town in the evening quiet, not talking much but with the particular ease of two people who have said the most important thing, and find the air lighter for having said it. He held her hand, and she allowed it, and it felt like the most natural arrangement in the world, like something that had always been intended, and had simply been waiting for the correct moment to occur. Margaret, who saw them come down the main street together in the nearly dark, made a small, satisfied sound over her account books that she never admitted to anyone. The summer of 1878 in Redrock was hot in the way that Texas summers were hot, which was comprehensively and without apology, and life arranged itself around the heat. Earlier mornings, slower middays, the evenings reclaimed for any work that required actual human energy. Clara and Jessie arranged themselves around life and around each other with the same pragmatic grace, each one continuing their own work and their own commitments while finding, in the spaces between, the increasing richness of a love that was building not on spectacle, but on the daily accumulation of knowing another person well. He had told her, sometime in July, about the years before Redrock, not just the trail driving and the ranch work but the harder edges of it, the times he had made choices he was not proud of because the options available to him had been limited and the consequences of choosing badly had been severe. He had told her about a winter in Kansas when he had worked for a man who turned out to operate on the wrong side of several legal and moral lines, and Jessie had left as soon as he understood this clearly enough to act on it. But leaving had required a confrontation that had not been easy and had left him, for a time, doubting his own judgment about people. She had listened to all of it without flinching, because she was not a woman who flinched at the truth of another person's life, and she had said, "A man who leaves when he understands something is wrong has better judgment than most, and better courage than many. The fact that it took time to understand does not change the fact that you understood it." He had looked at her after she said this with the expression she loved most on him, the one that was gratitude and affection, and something deeper than either. She had told him, in return, about the years after her grandmother's death, which had been her first real experience of being entirely alone and entirely responsible for herself, and about the particular loneliness of being a capable and self-sufficient woman in a world that was sometimes uncertain what to do with that combination. About the way she had learned to present only as much of herself as was useful in any given interaction, keeping the rest in reserve, because she had discovered early that offering all of yourself to people who did not know what to do with it was a reliable path to feeling both exposed and invisible simultaneously. He had said quietly, "I know how to do what to do with all of it," and she had believed him because he had already demonstrated it consistently, and because she was a woman who trusted evidence more than words and the evidence was substantial. In August, he found her a tree. This was not in Redrock, Texas in 1878, a small or easy thing. She had mentioned the oak tunnel near her grandmother's house twice, in passing, not as a request but as a memory, and he had listened the way he listened to everything, with the full attention of someone storing information they intend to use. 8 miles south of Redrock, where a stream ran through a dry-looking landscape with the stubbornness of something that refused to accept the climate's opinions, there was a stand of cottonwood trees that had grown tall and close together over the water, and in the full leaf of August, they came together at the top and made, if you walked through them along the stream bank, something that was not an oak tunnel in Virginia, but was, in its own way, a canopy of green over water-soft ground. And the light came through it in pieces, and the sound of the stream ran underneath everything. He brought her there on a Sunday morning, riding out on borrowed horses from Clyde's stable. Clara had been a competent rider since girlhood and had missed it, and he did not explain where they were going until they arrived, and she walked under the cottonwoods and stopped and looked up at the light coming through the leaves. He stood at the edge of the tree stand and watched her face, and the expression on it was worth everything. She turned to look at him after a long moment, and her eyes were bright in the same way they had been on the evening she told him about the house, except this time the brightness was not grief but something entirely different. "How did you find this?" she asked. "Rode around until I did," he said. She crossed to him and took his face in both hands and kissed him with a decisiveness that was entirely characteristic of her, The same directness and intentionality she brought to every other thing in her life applied now in this, and he wrapped his arms around her and held on with the same thoroughness. They stayed by the stream for the rest of the morning, letting the horses graze, sitting in the dappled shade, and talking about the future in the first direct way they had talked about it together. About what staying in Redrock would look like over longer time. About the practical questions. He had been offered a more permanent position by Garrett Wells, who had been observing his reliability for 3 months now, and had concluded that this was the kind of man you hired on long term if you had the sense to do so. About the fact that Clara had been quietly thinking about whether there was a way to expand her sewing work into something more formally her own, a proper shop rather than a corner of someone else's store, which required capital she did not yet have but might have in time with careful saving. He said, "Garrett's offer is a fair wage and the work is good. In a year I could have enough saved to help you start the shop." And then, because he was a man who did not do things halfway either, once he understood that they were aligned in this, he said, "And I would like if you are willing to talk about a future that is not separate from yours." She looked at him with steady, direct amber-brown eyes that had their own quality of light, and she said, "I am willing to have that conversation." "Clara," he said, "I am asking you to marry me. I am asking plainly and I am asking without any elaboration, because I do not think you need it and I do not have it in me to produce elaborate things when the simple thing is the true thing." She was quiet for one long, warm, complete second. "Yes," she said. "That is my answer. Yes." They were married in October of 1878 on a Saturday in the church whose bell had been silent since the minister left. Margaret Alcott, who had more civic authority in Redrock than anyone with an actual title, had written to the regional circuit preacher, who covered several counties in a loop across the territory, and arranged for him to come through on a specific date. And she had done this without consulting either of the people involved, because she had considered it settled since approximately May and saw no reason to wait for them to ask. The bell had been repaired by the smith 3 weeks before the wedding, at the insistence of the church committee, and it rang on the morning of the ceremony for the first time in over a year. Clara wore a dress she had made herself, because of course she had, in a deep blue wool blend that she had ordered specially from a supplier in San Antonio, with a fitted jacket over it in the same fabric that she had lined with the finest silk she could source within her budget, because she believed that how things felt on the inside mattered as much as how they looked from the outside. She wore her grandmother's earrings, which were the small pearl drops that had survived every move and every difficulty of the previous years, in a small box at the bottom of her trunk, and she carried a bouquet that Dora Webb had assembled from the last of the autumn wildflowers with a competence and a tenderness that made Clara hug her before the ceremony, which surprised Dora considerably. Jesse wore his jacket. The repaired one, the 6-year jacket, with the invisible seam at the shoulder and the clean wax thread stitching that held it solid and whole. He had polished his boots to a shine that startled Clyde Rourke into a compliment, and he had gotten his hair cut by the barber and stood at the front of the small church with the settled, decided expression of a man who had found his direction after 3 years of moving without one, and had no intention of moving away from it. When Clara came through the church door on the arm of Tom Ferris, who was delighted to perform this function, and had said so loudly to anyone who would listen for the preceding week, Jesse looked at her the way a man looks at something that resolves a long confusion into sudden clarity, and whatever was left of the careful reserve he had carried for years simply went out of his face and stayed out. The preacher was a brisk and practical man who nevertheless had a gift for the specific words that mattered, and the ceremony was short and honest and entirely appropriate. When they said their vows, the church was full. Redrock turned out as a town for weddings the way it turned out for very few other things, and the light came through the plain windows at the angle of late October morning, which is one of the best lights in Texas, and Jesse slid a ring onto Clara's finger that he had arranged with the jeweler who passed through on the supply circuit. A simple gold band that fit perfectly because he had, with characteristic thoroughness, determined her ring size by asking Margaret, who had noticed it 3 months earlier, just in case the information became useful. They celebrated at the general store, because it was the largest covered space in town and Margaret had offered it without hesitation. And Dora Webb and Mrs. Birch had been cooking since dawn, and produced a spread that made even the most culinarily indifferent members of the Redrock population take notice. There was dancing. One of the hands from the Crane Ranch had an excellent fiddle, and whatever his employer's character, the hand himself was generous with the music. And there was genuine community warmth, the kind that a small town produces when it recognizes that two of its own have found something real. Jesse danced with Clara in the cleared center of the store with the careful precision of a man who had danced rarely and wanted to do it well. And she was a better dancer than he was, and led him through his uncertainties without making them visible, which was, she would later reflect, one of their specific patterns applied to new territory. She led where she had the knowledge and he led where he had the knowledge, and they managed the spaces in between by paying attention to each other. He danced one dance with Margaret, because Clara told him to, and Margaret was a better dancer than either of them and seemed to find this privately amusing. They moved into a small house at the west end of Redrock that had been available since the surveying family moved on the previous spring. It was modest, 2 rooms downstairs, 1 room up, a good stone fireplace, a back area that could be a kitchen if you addressed it seriously, which Clara did within the first week. But it was solid and well situated and had a south-facing window that let in the best light of the day, and Jesse built a work table for Clara in front of that window before he built anything else in the house, because it was the most important thing and he knew it. The winter of 1878 was manageable by Texas standards, which meant cold without being catastrophic, and they settled into the life of the house and the town with the comfortable industry of 2 people who are naturally industrious and have found in each other both the motivation and the companionship for it. Jesse worked at Garrett Wells's ranch through the season, which was lighter work than the summer and allowed him more evenings at home, and Clara's work had grown to the point where she was handling more commissions than could easily be managed from the general store window, and the conversation about her own shop had become more concrete and specific. In January of 1879, Clara discovered she was expecting their first child, which she told Jesse on a Sunday morning over coffee at the kitchen table in the matter-of-fact way she told him everything that was important, directly and without preamble. He received the information with a stillness that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and was followed by the most completely open expression she had ever seen on his face, an expression of joy so uncomplicated and so fully present that it made everything else in the room seem slightly two-dimensional by comparison. He stood up from the table and came to her, and held her with both arms around her and his face against her hair, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed saying that the holding did not already accomplish. The baby came in September of 1879, a boy, which Jesse received with the same undiluted joy as the news of the pregnancy, and which Clara received with the satisfaction of completion, the sense that something had been building toward a specific moment and had arrived there. They named him James, after Jesse's father, with Thomas as a middle name, which had been Clara's grandfather's name, and which she offered, and he received as the gift it was intended to be. James Thomas Calloway was born on a Tuesday morning with the pragmatic efficiency of a child who has decided to get on with things, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable woman named Dr. Ann Harlow, who had arrived in Redrock in the spring, and whose presence was, as Margaret observed, a significant improvement in the town's overall circumstances. He was healthy and vocal, and had, from approximately the third day, the particular quality of someone who intended to be paying attention to everything, which Clara recognized immediately as a family trait. Jesse held his son on the first evening with the careful, astonished tenderness of a man handling something that has just permanently changed the coordinates of his world, and Clara watched him from the bed where she was resting with the particular warmth of a woman watching the person she loves encounter something enormous and meeting it fully. "He looks like he has opinions already," Jesse said. "He does," Clara agreed. "He is going to be difficult to argue with." "He gets that from you," Jesse said, and she laughed the full laugh, the one held in reserve for the right moments, and he looked up at her with the unguarded expression she loved most on him, and the room was full of something that had no adequate name in English or any other language, but that both of them understood completely. The following spring of 1880, Clara opened her shop. It was the storefront next to the general store, which had been a cobbler's until the cobbler's eyesight gave out and he went to live with his daughter in San Antonio. And it was small but well situated, and had excellent light through two large windows on the south wall. She had painted the exterior herself with Jesse's help on a Saturday in March, a deep green that she had decided on after considering every other color carefully, and she had a sign made by the smith's apprentice that read simply WHITMORI, CALLOWAY sewing, alterations and dress work, and she had kept her name in it because it was the name she had built the reputation under and because Jesse had said, "That is entirely sensible," without a moment's hesitation. The shop was, from its first week, successful in the particular way that genuinely good work is successful, not with fanfare but with the steady accumulation of people who find something worth returning to. She hired a young woman named Rosa Delgado, who was 17 and had been learning to sew from her mother, and had quickly surpassed her mother's teaching and needed someone who could actually challenge her skills. And Clara took her on as an apprentice with the intention of teaching her everything she knew, because that was how good work survived, not by being kept close, but by being passed forward. Rosa was quick and precise, and had an instinct for proportion that was either natural or the result of very careful watching, and she and Clara worked together in the green-fronted shop with the steady, productive harmony of two people who share a vocabulary that most of the world does not have. Jesse would sometimes stop in during the day when he was passing through town and find them both bent over a piece of work, heads together, discussing some technical point with the focused intensity of scholars, and he would leave again without interrupting because the work was important and he understood what important work looked like. He had, by the fall of 1880, taken on a partial ownership stake in Garrett Wells's ranch, which Wells had proposed when it became clear that Jesse's contribution over the 2 years of their arrangement had been substantially more than the wage suggested, and that keeping him required recognizing this in concrete terms. They had negotiated the arrangement over 2 evenings at Wells's kitchen table, with a directness that both men found refreshing after years of the oblique negotiations that Western business sometimes required, and had come to an agreement that was fair to both of them, and that gave Jesse a genuine stake in the success of the operation, rather than simply a wage for his labor. The water rights dispute between Pete Dawson and Hollis Crane had resolved itself, after the county filing and some subsequent correspondence, in Dawson's favor, and Crane had eventually accepted this with the bad grace of a man who had expected his influence to be sufficient and found it insufficient, and had refocused his energies on a different expansion that did not require anyone else's water. The West was large enough in 1880 that even the most aggressive men usually found room to operate without having to take it entirely from others if they were willing to look for it. And Crane was, whatever his other qualities, a pragmatist. Pete Dawson came by the shop one afternoon in the autumn and brought Clara a small basket of late-season apples from the trees his wife had been cultivating at the back of the ranch house, and he said, without excessive ceremony, What your husband did for my family, I will not forget. And what you have done for this town with this shop. My daughters talk about you the way they used to talk about the school teacher, which I think is the highest compliment women of this town can offer a woman they respect." Clara received this with genuine gratitude and the somewhat uncomfortable grace of a person who is not entirely used to being acknowledged, but has been practicing receiving it. James was walking by October of 1880, with the enthusiastic and imprecise locomotion of a 14-month-old, who has decided that upright movement is the most interesting available option regardless of what the surrounding furniture has to say about it. He had his father's eyes and his mother's expression, which was to say he watched everything with an attention that was startling in a child of his size and age, and then occasionally produced, from the midst of this watching, a particular decisive action that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. Jessie brought him to the stable sometimes on Saturday mornings, when the work was light and the horses were settled, and sat with him in the straw of the stable yard, and let him observe the horses from a safe distance with the careful introduction of someone who understood that you did not rush an animal or a child into comfort. You gave them the conditions for it and waited. James observed the horses with the same focused attention he applied to everything, and by December he was reaching toward them without fear, and Jessie would hold him and let him touch a nose or a shoulder with his small, deliberate hands, and watch his face go incandescent with the particular joy of contact with a large, gentle animal. Clara watched this from the stable doorway one Saturday afternoon in December, with the thin winter light coming in flat and clear across the yard, and she felt the full weight of where she was and what she had and found it, not for the first time and not for the last, to be extraordinary. She thought about the jacket. She thought about the Tuesday morning in April of 1878 when she had sat in Dora Webb's laundry room with a leather needle and wax thread, and told herself it was simply a practical matter, a piece of good work that needed doing. She thought about the quality of his eyes when he came in the next morning, and how he had said precisely that he had not asked, and the gentleness in the way he had said it that was the opposite of rebuke. She thought about lunches and evening walks and cottonwood trees by a stream and dancing in the general store, and a gold band that fit perfectly because he had paid attention. And she thought about September mornings and the weight of a small head against a shoulder, and the sound of a fiddle at a wedding and a green-painted shop door that said her name. She thought about her grandmother's garden and the road lined with oak trees that were no longer hers, and she understood that a place can be lost, and also that place is not, finally, what makes a home. What makes a home is the particular and irreplaceable combination of the people and the work and the days accumulated into something that becomes, over time, simply the shape of your life. She had that. It was hers, and it was solid, and it was made to last. Jessie looked up from where he was crouching in the straw with James and saw her in the doorway and smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she had seen arriving slowly over the course of 2 years, and that was now simply how his face was, how it had settled permanently into something open and warm where it had once been careful and closed, and he said, "Come here. He wants to show you the horse." She crossed the yard and crouched beside them in the winter light, and James turned from the horse to her face with the joyful surprise that small children produce when they see a beloved person in an unexpected place, and she took his small hand in hers and said, "Look how still he is standing, James. That means he trusts you." And James looked back at the horse with enormous, serious consideration. Jessie's hand found hers over James's small head, warm and certain in the winter air, and she leaned into his shoulder the way she had learned to lean, without calculation, without reservation, with the full weight of herself. And he held steady, the way he always held steady, which was the thing she had known about him before she knew anything else, from a distance, through a window, on a Tuesday morning in April in the wild and complicated country they had each found their way to and together made into home. It was the spring of 1881 when she found out she was expecting again, which she told him the same way she had told him the first time, directly, over coffee on a Sunday morning without preamble, and he received it the same way, which was with the 5-second stillness and then the unguarded joy and the holding. This time was different in small ways. James was there, pulling at Jesse's boot as he stood up from the table, demanding the attention that was his by right of being 20 months old and entirely sure of his place in the universe. And Jesse picked him up with one arm and held Clara with the other, and they stood in the morning light of their kitchen, with the south-facing window pouring spring sun across the good wooden floor. And the whole of it was so full and specific and real that Clara felt it like a physical thing in her chest. Not pressure but fullness, the kind that has no outlet except the eyes, which she allowed briefly and without apology. Jessie looked at her over James's head and saw the brightness in her eyes and said, gently, "All right." "Entirely all right," she said. "Better than all right. I am overwhelmed by the goodness of things, which is an unusual problem to have." "I share that problem completely," he said. Rosa Delgado took on more responsibility at the shop as Clara's pregnancy advanced, which she did with the quiet capability of someone who had been ready for more responsibility and had simply been waiting for the moment. She had grown, in the year she had been working with Clara, into a seamstress of genuine skill, and Clara had begun, in the month since, to teach her the full scope of the work, not just the technique but the judgment, the reading of fabric, the assessment of repair versus replacement, the particular mathematics of fit that separated good work from excellent work. Rosa absorbed all of it with the focused attention of a person who has found their calling and intends to honor it. The baby was born in November of 1881, a girl this time, delivered again by Dr. Harlow on a Tuesday morning, with the same efficient November light coming through the bedroom window. They named her Eleanor, after no one in particular, because both Clara and Jessie felt that sometimes a name deserved to be its own thing rather than a reference to something previous. She was dark-haired and steady-eyed from the beginning, and James inspected her with the careful uncertainty of a 2-year-old who has been informed that something significant is happening, but is not entirely sure yet whether to be pleased about it, and then decided, after perhaps a week of close observation, that she was acceptable, and that his appropriate role was to explain the world to her, which he began doing immediately in the earnest, partially intelligible monologue of a toddler who has a great deal to say. Jesse watched his children with the same attention he brought to everything, the careful, patient observation of someone who understood that the most important things revealed themselves slowly and rewarded watching. He was a different man at 33 than he had been at 29, not in his essential character, which had always been what it was, but in the specific gravity of someone who has found their ground and stands on it. He worked the Wells Ranch with the satisfaction of a man who has a stake in a thing he believes in. He came home each evening to a house that was warm and particular and fully inhabited, and he sat across from his wife at the kitchen table and talked about everything the way they had talked across the worktable at the general store in the beginning, which was with the full and easy attention of people for whom conversation is not a performance but a practice. The shop continued to grow. By 1882, Clara had extended the lease on the storefront and was considering a second room that would allow for fittings of the more elaborate kind. The wedding dresses and the occasion pieces that required a dedicated space with proper light and a full-length mirror, which she had managed without by improvising, but would be better managed with proper facilities. She discussed this with Jessie over a series of evenings and with Rosa during a series of work days, and the plan took shape with the deliberate care she applied to everything. And by the spring of 1882, the extension was in progress. Margaret Alcott, who had been watching all of this from the general store next door with the satisfaction of someone who had made an investment that had returned beyond reasonable expectation, occasionally emerged from her store to supervise aspects of the construction that she felt were not being attended to with sufficient thoroughness. And Clara let her do this because Margaret's thoroughness was one of the structural features of Redrock, and fighting it was a poor use of energy. And because Margaret was 75 years old and as sharp as she had ever been, and it would have been both ungrateful and unwise to suggest otherwise. On the evening after the extension's completion, when the new fitting room was finished and the mirror installed, and the whole thing smelled of fresh plaster and good wood, Clara stood in the middle of it in the last light of a May evening, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing built exactly as it was meant to be, not as a concession to practical limits, but as an expression of what was possible when you did the work with full attention and full intent. Jessie came to find her there because supper was waiting and James had declared twice that he was hungry, and he found her standing in the new room with that particular expression on her face, the one that was complete and quiet and pointed at nothing specific, but at everything. And he stood in the doorway and looked at her, and felt what he had felt that first morning when he held the repaired jacket in the window light of Dora's boarding house. The recognition of a specific quality in another person. The quality of someone who did things fully and honestly, and without requiring acknowledgement. The quality that had told him before he had any other evidence that this was someone worth knowing entirely. He had known. He had seen it before he understood what he was seeing, and he had been right, which was not always the case in his life, but was the case in this, and he was grateful for it every day in the particular way you are grateful for the most important things, not with ceremony, but with the steady, abiding acknowledgement of a man who understands what he has and intends to keep it. "Supper," he said. "I know," she said. "I was just looking." "It is very good," he said. "Yes," she said, "it is." She took his arm and they walked back through the shop and out into the May evening, where the green-painted door was standing open in the warm air, and the street was doing its evening business, and somewhere down toward the stable a horse made its evening comment on the world, and the lights were coming on in the windows of Redrock, Texas, one by one in the deepening blue of the evening sky. James was at the kitchen table when they came in, with Alina beside him in the chair that had been modified with a board across the arms to accommodate her small stature, and he was explaining something to her with the earnest intensity of a 3-year-old who has decided that his sister's education is a personal responsibility. And Alina was watching him with the steady, serious attention of someone who is younger but is not sure she is less informed, which would be a dynamic, Clara knew already, that would organize itself over many years into something wonderful and sometimes exhausting. Jessie settled into his chair, and Clara put the food on the table and they ate together in the warm light of the kitchen. And the conversation moved between the children and the ranch and the shop and the small events of the town, which was to say it moved between everything that mattered. And the evening was full of all the ordinary, extraordinary textures of a life that was completely, solidly, deeply lived. Later, when the children were in bed and the kitchen was tidied and the house had gone quiet, they sat for a while on the front step the way they sometimes did in the good weather, side by side, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, looking at the street and the stars and the particular version of the world that Redrock produced at the end of a day, which was modest and honest and not unremarkable if you paid the right kind of attention. "I have been thinking," Jessie said, "about something." "What something?" she said. "I want to plant trees," he said, "on the south side of the house where the wind comes in hard in the winter. There is room for 4 or 5 if we choose the right kind, and in 10 years they would be substantial." He paused. "I know they would not be oaks in Virginia, but they would be ours." She looked at him in the starlight with the full, warm, undefended expression that she had been learning over 3 years of marriage to produce without reservation, the expression that was her equivalent of his unguarded face, the one that was not held back or managed or presented but simply, honestly there. "Cottonwoods," she said. "If the water table is deep enough." "I believe it is," he said. "I checked." Of course he had. He had noticed something that mattered to her and had found out quietly, without announcement, whether it was possible, and had brought it to her when he knew. This was who he was. It was who he had always been, and who she had seen in him, before she understood what she was seeing, in the still way he held himself, and the attention he brought to every ordinary thing. She leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the street and the stars in the warm Texas night. And the future was in front of them like a good road in good weather, not without its difficulties, not without its demands, but clear and open and entirely their own. Trees that would grow tall. A shop that bore her name. A ranch with a stake worth having. Children who watched everything with too much attention and would grow into people who did things fully and for the right reasons. A jacket repaired with invisible stitching that had held through 3 years of use and would hold for many more. Everything necessary, everything whole, everything finally made to last.